Good morning, friends. Welcome to yet another lecture on English literature and criticism. Today we are going to deal with a slightly difficult but one of the most lovable poets of the Victorian era, Alfred Lord Tennyson. He was very popular not only for his poetry but also as a person extremely interesting, very humorous, and sometimes to a certain extent a little controversial as well. Joining me in this lecture along with me on to my right is Mrs. Namita Sharma.
Morning, students.
Both of us, we will take you through the life of Tennyson, we will take you through the Victorian era. To understand Tennyson, one needs to go back a little to understanding a few vital characteristics of the Victorian era as such. Once we understand these basic characteristics, I think then understanding Tennyson becomes much better,
easier.
His adaptation to the Victorian lifestyle, the way he lived, the way he wrote poetry. And
This is actually important because Tennyson was a very representative poet.
Okay.
No other poet perhaps represented his age in the way that Tennyson did, with perhaps like the exception of Shakespeare, we can say.
Okay. So probably in poetry, what is Tennyson is Dickens what is in novels?
The novel, definitely.
All right. On your screens, let's go to the first slide. On your screens is that beautiful picture of Lord Alfred Tennyson. But as I told you, friends, in order to understand Tennyson inside out, as a poet of course, though all of us we know that he wrote drama too, but in order to understand him, I think it's better that we first start taking a look at some of the characteristics of the Victorian era. If you look on your screen, right in the middle, you will see a beautiful picture of Queen Victoria. Madam, you would like to say something about her?
Yes, Queen Victoria has been the longest reigning monarch in British history.
Even more than the present Queen?
Yes, the present Queen I think should overtake her in a couple of years.
Okay.
But Queen Victoria ruled for 64 years.
Oh, okay.
The Victorian era in English literature, of course, begins from 1832 and the modern era started by 1890. But Victoria ascended the throne in 1837 students and passed away in 1901. Of course, her reign is equivalent to the glory of Elizabeth I's reign because, of course, I'm sure you've heard that in the Victorian age, the British Empire ruled over half the globe and it was said, of course, that the sun never sets in Victoria's reign.
All right.
A very loyal wife, of course, a glorious ruler.
Okay.
It is said that she was widowed in 1860 approximately.
1860.
60.
Okay.
And for 40 years, she still laid out Prince Albert's clothes every day. And after that, she never wore the crown, but instead wore a widow's dress.
Okay, that's very interesting. Coming back to the slide on your screen, Queen Victoria, it will be interesting to note again that Queen Victoria was the queen who started the tradition of wearing white clothes at the weddings. Yeah. Anyways, on the middle of the, on your screen in the middle, of course, is Queen Victoria's picture. If you look at your right, that is the Big Ben. On your left is the dockyard. Because of the Industrial Revolution, the dockyard had become a very, very busy place. And these are actual images, paintings of course. There was no photography in those days. But this just gives us a very, very basic, a very simple idea of what England was like. Let's come to the next slide then. What does the slide say? Victorian life was dominated by utilitarianism. Madam, what will be the meaning of utilitarianism?
It was a very practical life,
a commercial
life, because it was synonymous with the Industrial Revolution.
Probably
And
the money part which had begun to flow in
yes,
because of the
inventions were being made, and
Okay.
that is why, of course, the colonialism part was also important, because
Okay.
Britain was searching for markets for its produced goods.
Okay. So let's go back to the slide then. Victorian life was dominated by utilitarianism, and we just discussed the meaning of utilitarianism. It means a commercial aspect. The second point is very interesting. England was being rapidly industrialized, and machinery was coming to occupy the foremost position in English national life. Now, when there is machinery that is occupying the main or the center stage in any society's life, this simply means science and technology were overriding everything else. People were believing more and more in inventions and scientificity, if I can coin that word. Scientific nature and scientific attitude, I believe, was becoming the trend in those days.
And if I may interrupt here, Shobha, this is brought out in Dickens's novels, Oliver Twist with its workhouses, David Copperfield, which is partially autobiographical in nature, Hard Times, Pickwick Papers. In all these novels, Dickens has brought out this the life that people were leading at the time, a life of struggle and a life of workhouses, as I said, the exploitation of children, the exploitation of women as well. All this is reflected in the novels of the times.
Okay. So let's come back to the next slide. That is a picture, friends, of the London Stock Exchange in the Victorian times. And can you, if you look closely on your screens, can you look at the wide structure, the huge structure, all ironed structure, and look at the amount of people who are standing in the alleys, or whatever you would call it, the bull room as it was called. Look at the amount of people who were standing there in order to have some kind of trading, buying and selling of shares, and probably new factories which were coming up was giving them that occasion. This is just a symbolic way of presenting the utilitarianism and the scientificity of the Victorian times. Let's come to the next slide, which is giving us an insight into how the people were of that age. What does it say? The first point says here, it was a period when snobbery and hypocrisy held a sway over the minds of the upper class people. This is very important. I mean, if I were a student, I would have underlined the adjectives snobbery and hypocrisy. The second point is equally important. The Industrial Revolution, while aggravating the symptoms of distress, had appealed strongly to the baser instincts of the commercial classes. If I were to explain this a little more in detail, what was happening was that because of the Industrial Revolution, there were a lot of race for earning money. But then at the same time, this money was being earned by repealing and suppressing the lower classes, and which was ultimately leading to tremendous amount of divide and distress amongst the lower classes.
The rich and poor, as well as between the male and female. This was a time when education was not there for the women. In fact, women of affluent classes, they were sent to finishing schools, especially in Switzerland. And of course, French was a prerequisite for marriage. And then they were taught knitting and sewing, and only a very, very basic like literacy prevailed at the time.
Let's come to the next slide. Alright, those are pictures of upper class, high society Londoners particularly, and look at their fashions, rich clothes, exquisite garments. Just go back to the slide a little. Snobbery, hypocrisy. Now, can you see that in those pictures? The snobbish outlook, attitude, and those fashionable ladies simply coming out to Hyde Park to show off their clothes and their richness. Let's go a step forward. Robert Shelley, not the Percy Bysshe Shelley, who was a romantic, but this is another Victorian. Robert Shelley, a Victorian, very famously once said, poets are the acknowledged legislators of the world. And therefore Victorian poetry confirmed the Victorian values and pointed out the problems in their society. This simply meant that what Robert Shelley was trying to say, that poets are the acclaimed ambassadors, so to speak, for pointing out the strife, conflict, tension, worries. Poets are the perfect weapons or tools through whom probably the real society can be mirrored.
That is why we said right at the beginning that Tennyson was the representative poet of the age.
Exactly. So let's go back to the slide again. Let's see how Tennyson was actually a representative poet. Okay, the Victorian poets questioned the cost of exploiting the earth and human beings to achieve comfort for a few. And this feeling, it was actually beginning to take growth, and it was settling down amongst quite a few poets, that there was large-scale destruction and large-scale exploitation of the natural resources of the earth. I mean, this is what the point confirms. The second point again clarifies what we have said in the first point. They protested, the poets that means, or made fun of the codes of decorum or manners as well as authority. Now this picture, for example, makes it clear. The mannerisms were very elaborate, the fashions were very elaborate, and if you would not fall in that bracket, then you were, well, not really up to the mark. So this was something which the poets were protesting, or rather making fun of the codes of decorum or manners as well as authority. Let's come to the next slide. Okay, so now we are connecting the characteristics of the era to our poet Tennyson. Now that's interesting. What is written on the screen, if you read it carefully. Tennyson believed that the orderliness of the world and its natural beauty was a reflection of God's plan and His goodness. Let's read it again. Tennyson believed that the orderliness of the world, that means the system of the world, and its natural beauty was a reflection of God's plan and His goodness. Does this mean that Tennyson had immense faith in God and religion?
Definitely, yes, and this is brought out in several poems, as we will see later.
All right, okay. Fine, let's go back to the slide then. Tennyson believed in the presence of God and hence looked to the past lives of mythical characters to find ideals of human behavior. So, let's see, what are these mythical characters that he talks about? Okay, let's take a deep look at his few biographical details. Born on August the 6th, 1809 at Somersby. His parents were George and Elizabeth. Now this is something interesting. Tennyson's father was abusive and violent.
Shubha, if I may interrupt, we'd just like to tell our students that Tennyson hated biographies, as did many other writers such as George Eliot and even T.S. Eliot, Thomas Stearns Eliot. In fact, in his will, Eliot had put a clause that no biography should be written after his death. Of course, Tennyson fortunately did not have anything to hide as such. His was a very decent life, if I may say so. He was deeply in love with his wife, Emily Selwood, and he had two lovely sons, Hallam and Lionel. He had a family full of brothers and sisters, though yes, there were certain illnesses that prevailed in the family, which we will see in the following slides.
Okay. So, come back to the slide. Achha, that must have been the reason why Tennyson's father was probably abusive and violent.
Another reason was that his grandfather had disinherited Tennyson's father from the property. He had opted for a younger son,
Okay.
and everything was passed on to him. So
All right.
actually Tennyson's family did have to struggle to make a fortune. So that
Okay.
could have been one of the reasons.
All right. His early family life and childhood was marred by family strife. One brother was an opium addict, whereas another constantly fought with his father. All right, that's interesting to note. Early family life, childhood was full of a lot of family conflicts, a lot of family strife. An opium addict as well, very disturbing. There was much brooding over family inheritances, a theme that turns up in Tennyson's poetry later on. Again, a very interesting fact which we are sharing from his biography. Several men in his family had mental and physical problems like epilepsy, insanity, and excessive drinking. Must have really made his childhood a difficult childhood. But let's see how Tennyson could go ahead in life and overcome these problems. All right. Tennyson attended Trinity College, which is, of course, affiliated with the Cambridge University. He was invited to join the Apostles, an undergraduate club. Now, why we have mentioned this club? It is here that Tennyson met his lifelong friends. Friends who remained real friends till his very end. Let's see who are these very important friends. Before I change the slide, let's just take a note again. Tennyson attended Trinity College. He was invited to join the Apostle Graduate Club. And this club is important because it was here, in this club, that Tennyson met his lifelong friends. Okay. Madam, will you like to take it from here?
Of course,
No, can we have the slide back, please?
his most important friendship was with Arthur Hallam.
Okay.
And students, I'm sure you know that he has written his most famous poem in memoriam, in memory of Arthur Hallam. We'll discuss that as we go along.
All right.
And though Hallam and Tennyson were friends only for 4 years, yet theirs was a truly intense friendship, and it had a major influence on the life of Tennyson.
Okay.
In fact, students, Arthur Hallam was to wed Tennyson's sister.
Okay.
But unfortunately, he was, I think he was drowned, and that is why the marriage never took place.
All right.
Or I think he met with an early illness. I'm a little
Okay,
unsure on this.
okay.
But he died at the age of 22, and that came as a shock to Tennyson.
Is
And
that Arthur Hallam?
That
on
is
the screen?
Arthur Hallam,
Okay,
yes.
okay.
And later, when Tennyson wrote his poems, Morte d'Arthur, Arthur, in fact, was not only taken from Mallory's Arthur, but Arthur Hallam also was supposed to be the Arthur of
Okay.
Tennyson's poems.
All right.
And the
okay.
round table that he refers to
Right.
are the friends that they had in college.
Okay, so that is a very symbolic way of justifying.
Yes, his
Okay, let's
friendship.
go back to the picture of Arthur Hallam. That is why we're showing this picture again and again, because it's based on this friend that Tennyson wrote his most famous poem, In Memoriam. Okay. Hallam's death in 1833 at the age of 22 had a profound effect on Tennyson. And as we've just mentioned, the elegy written on the death of Hallam, In Memoriam, is one of Tennyson's greatest poems. Okay. So that's an elegy, but what is an elegy?
Elegy is, of course, a poem written on the death of someone,
Okay.
a sorrowful poem to
All right.
lament the death of someone.
Okay.
Here, of course, it says that elegy is a lyric that laments the death of a friend or famous public figure.
Okay, so can we take that as the definition of an elegy?
Definitely.
Okay.
And of course, here are more examples of elegies. Milton's Lycidas, which was written on the death of his friend Edward King. Shelley's Adonais on Keats's death. Students, you must have read Keats.
Please.
Arnold's Thyrsis on Clue. And of course, the most famous of them all, because it is a very general elegy that has been written on, that of course is Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard.
Okay, Okay. So, along with Tennyson's In Memoriam, I think we've also understood what an elegy is. Just to go back, elegy written on the death of Hallam, In Memoriam, is one of Tennyson's greatest poems. Okay. Taking our discussion a little forward, let's see what's next. All right, madam, this information.
This is, of course, some details on In Memoriam. It consists students of 131 smaller poems of varying lengths. The rhyme scheme is ABBA, and the stanzas are in iambic tetrameter quatrains.
Okay.
They are known, in fact, as In Memoriam stanzas. That is the name given to such stanzas. And interestingly, it took Tennyson 17 years to write this poem, In Memoriam.
Okay, that's interesting. Because if we go back a little to the slides, Hallam died in 1833. And 17 years means 1850.
Right.
Oh, that was quite a long time. It took him 17 years to write this poem. No doubt it is, no wonder it is one of his most famous poems. Okay. Carrying a discussion a little forward, let's see, what does In Memoriam represent? It represents his struggle with Hallam's death and with the new developments. Now this, I believe, is an important part. Not only is In Memoriam a struggle with Hallam's death that Tennyson had, but also with the new developments in astronomy, biology and geology that were diminishing man's stature in the universe. And after publication, now this is probably one of the most important events in Tennyson's life. After publication of this poem, Tennyson was named Poet Laureate.
That is right. He took over Shubha from Wordsworth in 1850.
Okay.
And 1850, in fact, was a very important year in his life.
Okay.
Tennyson was not born with a good ear for poetry as such.
Okay.
He developed it slowly, painfully, and this was in response to the hostile criticism that he met with when he initially published his poems.
Oh, okay, okay. So I believe this slide which is on the screen makes it clear that Tennyson was not only struggling with the loss of Hallam's death, but also he was perturbed, disturbed because of all that scientificity that we have spoken of earlier, which was now coming in a little too much.
Yeah, remember Shubha, this was the Victorian age, and students, you will be familiar with the term Victorian compromise. Because this was an age when science, of course, there was scientific development, new inventions had taken place, yet the church had a very strong hold on society. You have to remember that Darwin had just put in his theory that we have all of evolution, and this was something that was very difficult for the Victorians to digest, that we have actually evolved from monkeys. So this was an age when there was a compromise between many things, and this was brought out in Tennyson's poetry as well.
All right. Let's see the next slide then. All right, that is middle-aged Tennyson, not a very young fellow by now. That is Tennyson's wife, Emily Selwood. What was the year when they got married?
1850. In fact, they were engaged for a long time. But because Tennyson's poems were not successful, so Tennyson actually had to wait to marry Emily Selwood. And 1850 naturally was a very important year, because that was the year when he was made Poet Laureate, as I told you before, after Wordsworth's death. And this was the year when he married Emily Selwood finally.
And this was the year when In Memoriam was also published.
And that reminds me, In Memoriam ends with a marriage song celebrating the marriage of his sister Cecilia. So I told you that Arthur Hallam was engaged to Tennyson's sister, but that marriage could not take place. So this was a kind of, let's say, a celebration of sorts, putting behind perhaps the loss of Arthur Hallam in a final way.
Okay. So going back to Emily Selwood's picture, this is Alfred Tennyson, a middle-aged man, almost, I guess, the painting must have been drawn sometime around 1840s or something. Emily Selwood. Okay, this is an interesting point. It is interesting to know that Tennyson's Cambridge career. If you remember, just a few slides back, we told you that Tennyson attended Trinity College in Cambridge. But this is interesting, that Tennyson's Cambridge career was broken off because of family troubles and lack of money. Now, this is something interesting. He returned home, however, and continued to write poetry. His childhood and early days, very young days, were marred by family strife, we've already noted. So he returned home and continued to write poetry. He is an emblem of hard work and craftsmanship, as well as of genius. This is, I think, poetry with him was not, it was not spontaneous, the way Wordsworth has described, but it was something which was an acquired taste, probably.
Definitely, and the main thing to note is that Tennyson speaks not only of the past, as he does in several of his poems, for example, Idylls of the King, where medievalism is brought forth. But for his age, Tennyson also spoke of the future, as can be seen in Locksley Hall. In fact, speaking of medievalism, another famous poem is The Lady of Shalott. So, Tennyson was a genius in the sense that he could wed the past along with the future.
Oh, that is a very, very interesting way to put it
together.
Okay. Let's go back to the slide. After the career was broken off, he returned home, continued to write poetry, and because of that, he has been acclaimed worldwide to be the craftsmanship. It was an acquired taste. Alright, in 1830, Tennyson published his poems, which were called chiefly lyrical. Poems 1832 and 1833 were attacked by critics as obscure and affected. They were not well received at all. Tennyson was rejected literally as a poet, and he took this criticism to heart. And what was the result? The result was that such criticism kept Tennyson away from publication for another 9 years. That's a long time. That's a very long time.
Interestingly, Shubha, regarding In Memoriam, we have just stated, of course, that it is one of his most famous poems. But it will be interesting to note that T.S. Eliot called In Memoriam the most unapproachable of Tennyson's poems.
Oh, is it?
Yes.
Okay.
So, unfortunately, I guess every critic is entitled to his own views.
Okay.
But maybe, you know, the negative criticism that Tennyson initially met with polished him into a bigger artist, a greater poet, and he worked really hard to achieve that goal.
All right. So, let's come to the next slide then. Let's take a look at what happened then. His volume of poems, Poems 1842, established Tennyson's career as a writer. This volume included, these are the famous poems, Lady of Shalott, The Lotus Eaters, and Ulysses.
And Ulysses here reminds me, we spoke earlier, students, about the mythical heroes that Tennyson had taken up. If you are familiar with Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, then Ulysses deals with the subject taken up in the Odyssey. That is the hero there.
All right. Okay. Coming to the next slide on your screen, if you look at the screen, that is an old Tennyson. I believe that this portrait was drawn sometime in the 1870s or the 1880s. Tennyson's later poetry follows a narrative style. I mean, he takes on the role of a narrator, and several poems dealt with national affairs, affairs that were affecting Britain, England as a country. Okay, let us take a look at some of the themes in Tennyson's poetry. And that is a picture of Tennyson when he was being given the Poet Laureate title, and he had visited Buckingham Palace. That is the portrait that still hangs in Buckingham Palace.
Initially, incidentally, Tennyson had to be persuaded to take up the poet laureateship. He was just not ready.
All right.
And it was after considerable intervention on the part of Prince Albert that he accepted it. And it is said that Prince Albert personally paid a visit to the Tennysons when they were shifting into their new house in the Isle of Wight. And Queen Victoria herself persuaded Tennyson to accept this title and office.
Okay, that's interesting. Let's take a look at some of the themes of his poems then. On your screen you have the first slide. Tennyson was a poet of the natural and the psychological landscape. He was not a nature poet. Please understand the difference. He was a poet of the natural and the psychological landscape. He talks about the historical past as well. For example, the Lady of Shalott and Idylls of the King represent the medieval times. That's a very important aspect of Tennyson's poetry. There is a reason behind it, of course, which we will be discussing in a short while. So just pay attention to the fact that he was a poet of the natural and the psychological landscape, talks about the historical past, and those are a few illustrative poems from his such a theme. Let's take the next slide. Tennyson explores mythological works of Homer, Virgil and Dante. His poems Ulysses and Lotus Eaters are examples of this theme. I believe you just mentioned a couple of minutes back that Ulysses takes up the theme of Odyssey.
Odyssey, that's right.
His poem Ode to Virgil has references to Enid. Enid that was written by Virgil himself. Okay. Let's come to the next slide then on your screen. This is interesting. So far we have been, if you look at the slides, see mythological references to Enid, it's the psychological or the natural landscape, historical past. Now here we come to something interesting. Social and political concerns too are to be seen in Tennyson's poetry. For example, he explores the relations between the sexes in his poem The Princess. This is a very, very prominent part of Tennyson's poetry. He was very deeply concerned with what was affecting his country, how it was affecting, what could possibly be a solution maybe. Let's see how he uses this theme in which of his poems. Let's go back to the slide. All right. Will you like to take it from here?
Incidentally, before I take up the charge of the Light Brigade, in The Princess, Tennyson mentions that he for the field and she for the hearth. Okay. Otherwise, confusion would prevail. Of course, this was Tennyson's view, and we're all entitled to our own views. Feminists today may not agree, but he believed that a woman's role is in the house and a man's role is in the fields. He goes on to say that he for the sword and she for the needle. So a woman should take up needlework, whereas defending the home is a man's job.
All right.
Let's return to the charge of the Light Brigade, perhaps one of the most famous of Tennyson's poems. The charge of the Light Brigade questions political maneuvers. Here I mention political maneuvers, students, because this was written about a particular battle in the Crimean War where 600 soldiers were sent on a suicidal mission. They knew very well that their commandant had blundered, that they are going to fail in their mission, but still not a single soldier questioned this order. Each knew that their commander had blundered in giving the order, but they did not disobey. The role of the soldier, Tennyson mentions, is to not to make reply and not to reason why. So they followed orders and rode into the valley of death.
Okay.
It reflects Tennyson's emerging national consciousness, as we mentioned.
Okay.
His extreme patriotism,
all right,
and you would be interested to know that Tennyson later wrote the charge of the Heavy Brigade. This was on a successful mission fought by the British Army.
Okay.
Unfortunately, that poem was not as successful as
the
this
Charge of
one.
the Light Brigade.
And Tennyson has recorded the Charge of the Light Brigade in his original voice.
Okay.
He passed away in 1892, but a recording was done in 1890. And it was so famous that we can hear a recitation of this poem in Queen Victoria's voice as well.
Oh, goodness me. That's brilliant. So that was Charge of the Light Brigade, I believe, is one of the most significant examples of his social and political concern. I mean, he was deeply moved by the death of all those soldiers. One of the most prominent themes of his poem, actually. Taking this discussion a little further, all right, we come to a very interesting juncture, the Tennysonian hero. And if you look at your picture carefully, there is a beautiful, handsome-looking hero, but he is bound. All right, he is covered, he has been bound by wires, or I mean, there's something which is binding him. The hero feels suffocated. The hero is not free from bondages. So that is the Tennysonian hero. Let's see what kind of heroes did Tennyson create. All right, Tennyson's poetry obsessively invokes heroes and characters from earlier folk traditions and works of literature. For example, the Odyssey and Arthurian romance. So that Odyssey we've already been talking about, but the Arthurian, the King Arthur, or Prince Arthur rather, with the very famous medieval romance and his Prince Arthur and his adventures, the Round Table. So this was one of his heroes, and this is important. Tennyson's poetry obsessively invokes. I mean, he was obsessed with these heroes, so to speak. All right, Tennyson's heroes and heroines were very familiar to the Victorian readers, representing a glorious past in which great deeds were possible. This is again a very trademark kind of sign of Tennyson's poetry. Heroes and heroines were particularly presented in that time where maybe they would go on long, huge adventures, win great victories, great battles, and then come back. And that is the kind of glory which was absent in the Victorian era, and that is why Tennyson kept on probably looking for his heroes in the medieval times. That could be one of the reasons. Let's come back to the slide. Okay, however, Tennyson pictures his heroes and heroines in static mode. Now, what would be the static mode? Somebody is stuck, immobilized, unable to enact. In other words, stagnated. Unable to enact what? The heroic deeds for which they have become famous. Alright, so Tennyson's heroes, they go back to a time where they want to do something heroic, but something pulls them back. Something does not make them succeed in achieving the glory of the past heroes. Let's come back to the slide then. Okay, this is interesting. Tennyson's heroes are semi-godlike. And is that a picture of...
I think it should be King Arthur.
King Arthur.
And that student's in his hand, that sword. Can we have the slide, please?
Can we have the slide, please, again?
That sword was famous. It is known as Excalibur. And it is said that the sword was buried in a rock, and whoever could remove the sword would become king. Arthur managed to remove it. Several tried, something similar to the Dhanush that Ram was able to break.
Right.
And Arthur, of course, managed to pull out the sword, and he became king. Later, as it is mentioned in Morte d'Arthur as well, he returns the sword to a barge and to a lake, I beg your pardon, and in the lake a hand comes out, catches the sword, and that hand sinks back into the lake with the sword again.
Okay, that's interesting. And this is also noteworthy. The Tennysonian hero is also fallen because of the decay that had set in the Victorian times. with man embracing science for all his needs. I believe all Victorian writers, whether it was Dickens or Arnold or Tennyson, they were all rebelling against the scientificity or the all-pervading science which was taking over Victorian life.
They were afraid of the loss of faith that they were seeing all around them.
Okay.
As Arnold mentions in Dover Beach, he asks his beloved or his wife to be true to one another.
Okay.
Because they were afraid that this new science would take them away from religion as such.
Okay. And I believe that is the reason why Tennyson's, if you look at the second point on your screen, his heroes are unable to move forward, but are obsessed with possibilities that they cannot realize. And that is something sad. The heroes, if I go to the beginning of the slide where I showed, that is the picture of a hero bound. He is not free. There is something which is pulling him back.
This, I believe, represents Ulysses.
All right, okay, probably. So that's what, in fact, when he remembers Arthur, he's remembering King Arthur because of the successful adventures that he could complete. But the Tennysonian hero, well, he failed to do that. Okay. His heroes are unable to move forward but are obsessed with possibilities that they cannot realize. After having discussed his life, the Victorian era, after having discussed his themes, the Tennysonian hero, I believe we will just talk a little, if time permits us a little, we have little time left, but we'll just talk a little about
His poems.
And on your screen, I will put the first poem that we will read out. I hope you're all glued to the screens. I'll read out the poem and then Madam will comment on it. Tears, idle tears, I know not what they mean. Tears from the depths of some divine despair rise in the heart and gather to the eyes. In looking on the happy autumn fields and thinking of the days that are no more. Fresh as the first beam glittering on a sail that brings our friends up from the underworld, sad as the last which reddens over one that sinks with all we love below the verge. So sad, so fresh, the days that are no more. Ah, sad and strange, as in dark summer dawns, the earliest pipe of half-awakened birds to dying years. When unto dying eyes the casement slowly grows a glimmering square. So sad, so strange, the days that are no more. Dear as remembered kisses after death, and sweet as those by hopeless fancy feigned, on lips that are for others. Deep as love, deep as first love, and vile with all regret. Oh, death in life, the days that are no more.
Tears, Idle Tears was a part of The Princess, and as we mentioned before, it discusses the man-woman relationship.
Okay.
It was published in 1847,
All right.
and it is said that Tennyson was visiting Tintern Abbey, where Hallam was laid. Maybe his close proximity to Hallam's grave brought out such sad thoughts in him.
Okay.
The lines autumn. Autumn, remember, is the season that hails winter. Winter for us in India is a very pleasant season, but for them in Europe, it is a season of death, or it is a season when nothing grows.
Okay.
If we compare the seasons to life, then winter can be equated to death. Autumn brings about death.
All right.
So when he remembers, or when he sees autumn, he remembers the summer and spring that have already passed by. And of course, the summer that is youth, spring that is infancy or early childhood, bring back the thoughts or the sweet memories of Hallam. Remember, students, there is another poet who is famous for Tintern Abbey, and that is Wordsworth. But Wordsworth ends his poem on a happy note, whereas unfortunately Tennyson is forced to end his on a sad note, because seeing Tintern Abbey or remembering Hallam brings back tears, but again he feels that these are idle tears because they are in vain, they are fruitless. He realizes that it is useless to cry, but he cannot hold back the tears.
Okay, that was a wonderful comment on tears, idle tears. We'll go to another poem.
If we have time, then I think we should.
We
can
still
hurry up
have a little time. We can take another very famous poem, Mort the Arthur.
Right.
I'll recite it, and I would request you to comment on it.
Please.
And slowly answered Arthur from the barge, the old order changeth, yielding place to new, and God fulfills himself in many ways. Lest one good custom should corrupt the world, comfort thyself. What comfort is in me? I have lived my life, and that which I have done, may he within himself make pure. But thou, if thou shouldst never see my face again, pray for my soul. More things are wrought by prayer than this world dreams of. Wherefore, let thy voice rise like a fountain for me night and day. For what are men better than sheep or goats that nourish a blind life within the brain? If knowing God, they lift not hands of prayer, both for themselves and those who call them friend? For so the whole round earth is every way, bound by gold chains about the feet of God.
Thank you, Shubha. These lines, Mort de Arthur, that Mort means death of Arthur. These are the final words of King Arthur that he speaks to Sir Bedivere. Sir Bedivere is one of the knights, and I would like our first year students to pay special attention, because this year you have Sir Gawain and the Green Knights.
Okay, yeah.
Sir Gawain was a nephew of King Arthur, and Sir Bedivere was another knight who was very close to King Arthur.
Okay.
And Sir Bedivere questions Arthur. He asks him, "What shall I do from tomorrow? Where should I go? For the round table is no longer there. The knights are defeated." And then King Arthur answers, "The old order changeth, yielding place to new."
Okay.
And thus God fulfills himself in many ways, lest one good custom should corrupt the world. So what does Arthur say? Arthur says that change is needed. Otherwise, we will stick to the old customs. And change is a part of nature. We have to go on. Mort de Arthur was a part of Idylls of the King. It was meant to be written as the final chapter of Idylls of the King, but later Tennyson changed his mind and included it as one of the poems in Idylls of the King. Idylls of the King, incidentally, was dedicated to Prince Albert. And Arthur here represents, as I told you before, Arthur Hallam, and the round table, of course, represents his friends. But the passing of Arthur also represents the passing of many values that Tennyson felt they were losing in the Victorian age. Of course, it is difficult, Shubha, to do justice to this poem in the span of 1 hour.
Very famous lines, the old order changeth,
yielding place to new. Several lines, in fact, are often quoted from Tennyson. Break, 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 another poem that you must have read, students. Unfortunately, we could not discuss it here due to the shortage of time. But I hope that we have been able to discuss Tennyson at least so that it can be some benefit to you. And I hope that you have enjoyed the lecture as much as we have enjoyed bringing it to you. Shubha, would you like to say something?
Tennyson as a poet, I mean, he's a very lyrical poet. He's a very wonderful poet. But I mean, some of his lines, for example, the last slide that we read, lest one good custom should corrupt the world, and particularly God fulfills himself in many ways. Probably I thought that this was Tennyson's way of coming to terms with the changing Victorian world.
Absolutely, because he says
more
things are wrought by prayer than man can think of.
So Tennyson kept his faith till the end. That is the more important part. Though his early life was poor, marred by strife, but the latter part was good, long, fulfilling life. He died in 1892, but he has left back some very immortal work behind.
Definitely.
And I'm sure that you have enjoyed the lecture, friends. Next week, we'll come again, once again, with another topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.